I believe that if I could change the hookup on that recording machine so that instead of recording your brain waves, I could utilize the energy output and receiving field of an abnormally sensitized human being, like you, for instance, I could bring in that impulse so strongly that I could record it constantly and perhaps learn to read its message. Eventually, I may bring back my wife's actual voice and show the world how to talk to those who've passed beyond the grave.
If you can do what you're trying to do, you'll own the world. You know that, don't you?
Good evening, guys and ghouls, and welcome back to Monster Craze Memoirs, a generational podcast about B-movies. I am your host, Ian Garcia, and joining me, as always, is my father, Rocco.
Hello.
So we're coming to our penultimate episode reviewing the films that Boris Karloff made with his stint at Columbia Pictures from 1939 through 1942. We've watched so far The Man They Could Not Hang, followed by The Man with Nine Lives, and then Before I Hang, and we now come to the fourth film in the saga, A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to My Hanging. Just kidding, the name of the movie is The Devil Commands, although that's really just a BS title. It really has absolutely nothing at all to do with what the movie is about. Just preliminary thoughts, what did you think of The Devil Commands, Father?
I liked it. I liked the movie. It's rather... despite the tedious acting of Boris Karloff and basically just, formulaically going through these roles, they're all the same. You could switch movies and it'd be the same individual. Although he's less mad in this one. I guess that's hard to tell. It happens later. But, but you have a good script, pretty good script that changes the dynamics of what's going on in terms of what makes him fanatical about something. And also you have a fairly good supporting cast that tends to round out the movie. But there are problems with it, but it's a good movie. I really enjoyed watching it. I've never seen it before. So
there's a lot of interesting things about this movie in the context of the three previous films that we've watched. I guess the first thing to discuss is just the change in personnel who are behind the film. This is once again being produced by Wallace McDonald, who produced the last three of the Mad Doctor movies starring Boris Karloff, or what are now termed his Mad Doctor cycle when they're describing his period working for Columbia at this time. The previous two films, The Man They Could Not Hang and The Man with Nine Lives, those were written by Carl Brown. With the third movie, Before I Hang, the screenwriting credits were handed over to Robert Hardy Andrews, who now also finds himself co-writing the screenplay for The Devil Commands with a guy named Milton Gunzburg. There's nothing much interesting about Milton Gunzburg's career per se. He was he worked in the writing department for MGM, but he's better known for his role, far from being a screenwriter, as he's better known for his development along with his brother Julian and the cinematographer Freend Baker of the stereoscopic 3D system Natural Vision, which during the golden age of 3D movies in the 1950s would be the standard bearer in terms of how those, in retrospect, fairly mediocre attempts at stereoscopic 3D would be. But I think what is even more interesting about this film is that it's the first of the Mad Doctor movies to be adapted from a contemporary literary source. The source for this movie is a novel by a guy named William Sloane called The Edge of Running Water, which was originally published in 1939. I did have the opportunity to read The Edge of Running Water before we saw this movie, and the thing that surprised me was how remarkably faithful the Columbia Pictures adaptation actually was to the at least as far as the setup and the characters of the story, although the structure of the film is radically different from what we see in the novel. And obviously, I think the character focus is also significantly different from the novel. And there's another interesting personnel change in that the director of the film, as opposed to Nick Grind or Nick Grinde, he has, for whatever reason, he has this accent put on the E in his credits in these Mad Doctor films, but he has been replaced as director for this fourth Mad Doctor film by a guy named Edward Dmytryk. Now, Dmytryk had actually come up in the film industry as an editor. He started working at Famous Players Lasky, which had which was the production company whose distribution partner was Paramount Pictures. Eventually, Famous Players Lasky got folded into Paramount Pictures, and Dmytryk had fairly consistently worked with Paramount through his career, working up the rungs from being a messenger boy in the editing department to being a projectionist to being an assistant editor to being an editor himself. But by the time we're coming to the creation of The Devil Commands, he had actually in 1939 been promoted by Paramount to being a director. What had happened was that, he, at various points in his career, on the films he was editing, he was allowed the opportunity by certain directors like Kurt Newman and Louis King and George Cukor to either direct certain scenes or to observe or to practice setting up shots and camera setups, in order to give him a sense of how to go about the production of a movie. But so what ends up happening is that in 1939, Paramount offers him a job as a assistant director on a production called $1 Million Legs, and who should Dmytryk be assisting on the direction of $1 Million Legs? None other than Nick Grind, the eventual director of the previous three Mad Doctor movies. And what ends up happening is that Grind, whose last two films for Paramount had underperformed at the box office, he ends up getting sacked after a week of shooting, which leads to Dmytryk taking over as director. He directs the entire ending sequence of $1 Million Legs. He's then offered a directing contract of $250 a week, signed in June 1939. He directs 4 B pictures for Paramount before a management shakeup leaves him out of the job. So he then goes into becomes an independent director in directing B programmers. First for Monogram Pictures, he directs a movie called Her First Romance. He then ends up making The Devil Commands. So there's this eerie coincidence where he got his start officially as a director, replacing Nick Grind on a movie at Paramount. Now he's coming over to Columbia and making another movie where he is once again taking over for Nick Grind. Although why Nick Grind was either ill-disposed to direct a fourth Mad Doctor movie or was simply dismissed by Columbia Pictures, right. I'm not quite sure.
But it's good. It's interesting that he cut his teeth on these films. I mean, in terms of his direction, he did do the Caine Mutiny with so he did, and that was a nationally acclaimed movie, right?
Yeah. Dmytryk is a controversial figure because I think he's better known now as being one of the Hollywood 10, which was a group of screenwriters, and Dmytryk, the one director among them, who were notorious because they went before the House Un-American Activities Committee and refused to answer the question about whether they were now or had ever been a communist. Dmytryk was the only one of the Hollywood 10 who was actually found in contempt of Congress and actually spent 10 months in jail as a result of his contempt of the proceedings. But what's remarkable is that once Dimitrik comes out of jail, unlike a screenwriter who, even if you're blackballed from the industry, it's still possible for you, with some sympathetic parties or some fellow travelers who manage to skate under the punitive eye of the sort of anti-communist groups in Hollywood or the House Un-American Activities Committee. Unlike a screenwriter where you could just ghost write a movie, if you're a director, you really don't have a choice if you're being blacklisted from the industry. So what Dimitrik ends up doing is that in order to escape the blacklist, he ends up naming names. He ends up going again before the House Un-American Activities Committee and giving them a list of people who he is aware either are communists or were communists, or the same thing for communist sympathizers and so-called fellow travelers. So he's better known for that, and as a result, he's a very controversial figure because it's one of those things where he was able to have a very successful career in the late 40s and the 50s, whereas other filmmakers who hadn't named names, who hadn't cooperated, were, simply had their lives and their careers destroyed by the anti-communist hysteria of the period. But nonetheless, Dimitrik is a very important filmmaker in the sort of regard that he's often cited as being incredibly influential on the development of the film noir. And I think it is interesting that we keep coming back to this point where a lot of the horror movies that we see, either coming out of the golden age or in the second wave of horror movies that begin in 1939 and continue through the 40s, I think it's interesting that we do see the start of a development of a cinematographic style that is contemporaneous with the development of film noir, in which you see this increasing dependence on the heavy layering of shadow, harsh contrast between light and dark, and more importantly, a more psychological focus in terms of what the horror films are about. There's always been a psychological dimension, to be sure, in the previous Mad Doctor films we've watched, but I think it stands to be said that The Devil Commands is much more straightforward in terms of how psychology relates to Boris Karloff's character, because without getting yet into the synopsis, it seems interesting to me that as opposed to previous Mad Doctor films where the monomaniacal drive of the Doctor is born out of his pathological need to be in control and his sense that he's been betrayed by a ignorant and fearful and idiotic society that can't support his genius. In this film, it's much more mundane. The thing that motivates him is a profound trauma, which is produced through the loss of his wife, which both makes him a much more sympathetic character, but it also, in ways that I think we'll unpackage later, it plays interestingly with our perception of what the point of the ending of The Devil Commands is supposed to be, because it is a kind of it's one of those things where the film is a little too literal, but there is an element of a kind of psychological ambiguity to it, isn't there?
There is. Yes, I agree. I agree with that. Yep.
And I mean, as far as like noir elements, I think there's also in the character of Ms. Walters, played by Anne Revere's character, there's this there's it's interesting that she seems to be almost a kind of femme fatale character. She never manipulates someone with her sexuality, but she's definitely portrayed as this kind of evil woman who has a kind of perfidious influence on like this, the otherwise more sympathetic Boris Karloff character. But maybe we'll be in a better position if we actually do just go into the synopsis now, and then we can build upon the interesting aspects of the movie, and then hopefully later on the book that it's based upon, because being able to discuss the similarities and the differences between the book and the movie, I think is really fascinating. But here we go as far as the synopsis. Boris Karloff plays Dr. Julian Blair, an electrophysicist who has invented an advanced electroencephalogram that can record not only the electrical pulses produced by the human brain, but also the unique wave patterns of each subject's thoughts, which he discovers are as unique to the individual as their fingerprints. On the night of demonstrating his amazing device to some colleagues at his university laboratory, his wife Helen, Shirley Ward, arrives and reminds him that their daughter Anne, Amanda Duff, is expected to return that night by train for her birthday. It's a busy, rainy night in the city, and while Helen is driving around the block waiting on Julian to pick up Anne's birthday cake, she gets into an auto wreck and is instantly killed. Emotionally unmoored after the burial of his wife, Julian spends the night at his laboratory aimlessly tinkering with his machine, but discovers that when he turns it on, that the EEG still records his wife's unique brain patterns. Julian is convinced that his new machine has unlocked the key to piercing the veil between the plane of the living and the world of the dead. Amazingly, none of his colleagues brings up the possibility that the most likely reason that his device is recording electrical patterns is that, in the absence of a subject, is because it doesn't actually work. At any rate, in spite of the words of concern from his colleagues, his daughter Anne and his research partner Richard Sales, played by Richard Fisk, Julian is determined to pursue his new track. With his simple-minded helper Carl, Ralph Penny, in tow, he attends a seance performed by one Mrs. Walters, Anne Revere, in hopes of better understanding communication between the living and the dead. Mrs. Walters, it turns out, is a fraud, and the ever-perceptive Julian easily exposes her methods. But he is surprised to discover that when he asks Walters about the source of the powerful electrical shock he received from her during the seance, she has no idea what he's talking about. Bringing her back to his lab at the university, Julian discovers that Mrs. Walters' body and brain are, in fact, capable of both emitting and, more importantly, receiving electrical currents that would kill the normal person. Julian recruits Mrs. Walters to assist him in his experiments, convinced that he can modify his machine not to record the thoughts of the subject, but to use her abnormal energy output and receiving field to channel communications from the beyond, basically using her as a giant human vacuum tube to receive thought patterns like radio signals. Unfortunately, even Mrs. Walters' abnormal electrophysiology isn't enough to receive anything, so Julian attempts hooking the happily compliant Carl up as well in order to increase the machine's receptivity. The result is that Carl suffers extreme mental trauma that renders him a mute, lumbering brute. Convinced by the psychopathic Mrs. Walters that discovery of Julian's criminal negligence will doom his research forever, Julian quickly has his house in the city sold off, he sends Anne away, and he buys a new, dilapidated manor along the craggy coastal cliffsides of an isolated Maine town called Barsham Harbor. You know, it's been a question in my mind in past horror movies about why it always seems that mad doctors seem to have so much money to buy these, remote palatial estates that always seem to be very close to cliffsides. At least in this movie, we actually get to see a doctor literally selling his home to get the money, and getting that to that house is actually part of the development of his character. So I actually appreciated that aspect of the movie. Julian continues performing his macabre experiments in total secrecy for 2 years, only for the local sheriff Ed Willis, Kenneth MacDonald, to come calling one inopportune night in the interest of inquiring if the queer new inhabitants of the manor know anything about the 5 cases of grave robbing that have occurred in Barsham Harbor in the 2 years since Julian and Mrs. Walters showed up. The sober Sheriff Willis doesn't share the tribalistic townsfolk's same intrinsic prejudice against outsiders, but the facts are that someone is robbing graves, the grave robbing correlates to the arrival of a bunch of oddball outsiders, and unless Willis can get to the bottom of this case soon, well, then you've got the recipe for a good old rabble and mob. Willis manages to convince Julian's reluctant housemaid, Mrs. Marcy, Dorothy Adams, to do some snooping around to find out what the old scientist is up to. Conveniently, Julian accidentally leaves the door to his lab unlocked one night, and when Mrs. Marcy sneaks inside, she discovers a ghoulish sight indeed. Effectively, Julian has expanded his EEG machine to be a replica of a seance table, with Mrs. Walters' seat at the head and the adjoining receivers manned by the human corpses he has stolen. Terrified, Mrs. Marcy accidentally flips a switch that turns on the machine, producing an interdimensional vortex at the center of the room, the force of which is so strong that it pulls Mrs. Marcy in, killing her as she is slammed against the table. With Mrs. Walters' calculating mind as a guide and malevolent influence, Julian adds Mrs. Marcy's body to the machine and covers up her death, making it seem as though Mrs. Marcy slipped from the cliffside on her way home from the manor. Mrs. Marcy's husband, Seth, isn't buying it, and Willis's control over the town rabble slips ever more from his control. Anne and Richard arrive out of the blue to try to convince Julian to come out of seclusion. In the meantime, Seth works up the townsmen into a frenzy, and the mob is shortly on its way. Julian reveals his experiments to Richard in an attempt to convince him to help him complete his work in the short time that he knows he has before he's found out. Mrs. Walters is completely exhausted from a previous experiment which successfully conducted Helen's thought patterns, and Julian, maddened by desperation, now plans to use Anne in her stead. When Richard refuses to help, he has Carl incapacitate him. With Anne in the receiving chair, Julian opens the vortex just as the mob arrives, overwhelming Carl and storming up the stairs of the house just as Richard himself wakes up and vainly struggles to break down the door to the laboratory. As the interdimensional maelstrom grows stronger still, Julian begins hearing Helen's voice, though whether this means his device has worked or that he is succumbing to madness is uncertain. Whatever the case, the force of the vortex is so strong that it brings the entire laboratory and much of the manor crashing down around them. Richard struggles to his feet and enters the lab to find Anne exhausted but unharmed. Julian, on the other hand, has disappeared without a trace, apparently sucked through the vortex into whatever unknown world lies beyond the doorway he created. I think in regard to what you were saying about Karloff's performance in this film, I actually think I might disagree in the sense that I think the performances in this film are probably one of the best things about it. Like, I think Dimitrich's direction is quite good. I find his layering of light and shadow very interesting. But at the end of the day, I don't think his direction is considerably different from Nick Grind's direction from the previous movies. Maybe that's appropriate because they're all part of a sort of sequence. But I think the really great thing about this movie is that it really is stacked with a good, substantial cast that are all given very meaty roles to play. And I think with Boris Karloff's character, I think the thing that pleased me the most about his character is that in previous Mad Doctor films, we're always introduced to him in media res as a guy who is already sort of super serious, super focused on his research, and is very much a loner. He doesn't have time for much else besides his research. He's always very considered, and he has this sort of sense of having this looming thing hanging over his head about the importance of his research. Whereas I think the great thing about the way The Devil Commands opens is that we get a version of Boris Karloff as a doctor who is not yet mad, but is also a kind of like, personally identifiable. There's an almost like everyman quality to him, especially I think in the scene where he's leaving the university with his wife. He's getting into the car and she's reminding him about the fact that he's absent-minded and he forgot it's his daughter's coming home and it's her birthday. Karloff is so animated in that very brief window of time, and it really does seem like he's trying very much to channel something different about this character that is appropriate to the film. So then when he transforms, again, for a more identifiable reason because of its trauma, I think the character aspect of this movie is a lot stronger than it was in the previous films.
Right, but just because of the way it's written, yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, the idea is he does have more of a human dimension to him, the way it's set up. That's because of the writing. But basically what I'm trying to say is that nothing more than the fact that Karloff pulls it off. He does show that kind of dual behavior before and after the actual trauma. But, like I said, you're right. It all works together well. He is more complex in this one. I have to admit that, because he's not all alone
Right.
in his own monomaniacal kind of thinking in terms of his science. He's
Do you feel like he was maybe phoning it in to a certain extent? Like, or like I'm.
What do you mean phoning it in?
Well, I mean, sort of what you're saying, that like he's sufficient in the role, but it seems like there's
no.
something you felt left something to be desired.
No,
in terms of,
no. I think you're right. What you say is spot on. There is definitely more complexity to him, and Karloff does pull it off. I mean, he does pull it off. I'm just saying, in the overall theme of these movies that we've seen so far, it'd be good if we can see a little bit more of fleshing out his gradual change.
Right. Yeah.
And that's all. That's all I'm trying to say.
Maybe a few more like days in between the death of his wife and the burial of his wife and the search for like some sort of meaning, rather than literally within the span of a couple days he just goes from. I mean, it's like, I think you're right to a certain extent.
I
think that's appropriate because it will relate later in terms of like how these movies are structured, and also the differences between how the film and the novel decide to tell the story. I will say this: I did find this very interesting quote from Karloff, which I'm citing from a book written by Fintan McDonough. Fintan McDonough is the author of a book on Edward Dmytryk's films called Reassessing His Life and His Films and His Life. And he cites Karloff as saying in that book, "I must confess that I didn't accept this constant and continual madness quite placidly myself." I think he means the constant and continual madness of the characters he's playing. "Once during the crazed scientist cycle, I said wearily to the producer, 'These things are all right, but don't you think we should perhaps spend a little more in the writing or change the format?' He was in an expansive mood. He meaning the producer. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a great chart. 'Here,' he said, 'here's your record. We know exactly how much these pictures are going to make. They cost so much. They earn so much. Even if we spent more on them, they wouldn't make a cent more, so why change them?'" I think there's an element to it where it's like, I think Karloff is at an interesting point in his career because he's pretty much played all of the stock characters that he could in the horror genre. He's played a monster, he's played a heavy, he's played one of those sort of, very much like Carl in this film, in The Old Dark House, he played one of those mute, sinister servant types. He's played mad scientists, and really he's spent a lot of time playing mad scientists as well as, mad priests and mad everybody. And it seems like this was an interesting point in his career because he's right on the verge of being in Arsenic and Old Lace. In fact, on December 9th, when he was supposed to be wrapping his takes for the film, he actually persuaded Edward Dmytryk to rush his filming of his scenes so that he could make the flight to be in New York City on December 10th so that he could start rehearsals for Arsenic and Old Lace. And as we know, he makes Arsenic and Old Lace, and for the first time, he's making a straight salary. He's also making interest on the box office, and he has a stake in the film rights. It's about to be a big game changer, not only in terms of the characters he's able to play, but also his personal professional success. I think what we're seeing, unfortunately, in a film like The Devil Commands, because really The Devil Commands is exactly what he's looking for. It is a change in the format. It is a change in, there is more investment in the writing simply by virtue of the fact that it is drawn from a fairly substantial novel. William Sloane's The Edge of Running Water is a pretty good book with elements of mystery and science fiction and melodrama. But I think we're seeing him that despite that, he's at this point in his career where he's starting to get a little jaded, like, I think he has this sense that he's ready to move on. But just like that producer said to him, we're not going to invest any more in you because we already have predetermined you're only worth so much. That, and I think, like, to have it put to you that straightforwardly, that's going to have an effect on your acting. That's going to have an effect on the perception of how much the production is entitled to your talents and to your commitments.
Maybe sometimes professionals do go to the best they can, even under that kind of direct analysis of what they, of the money side, how much they're going to make and what kind of investment and what kind of returns they're going to get. I mean, at least they were frank with them.
Yeah.
But, I like I said, I think it's a very good movie. I liked it a lot. I mean, there's a lot more. I think they could have spent a little more time on trying to help people try to understand whether he's really achieving something or whether he's just on the insane part now. He's starting to become insane. And I wish they would have fleshed that out a little bit. I mean, this vortex thing that they produces and stuff like that. And it just seems it's really an interesting movie because there is an element of maybe there is something because of the fact that we talked about this off air when we saw the movie, that there's something very insidious and evil in this film. The fact that,
and The Devil Commands doesn't quite capture it as a title.
No,
There's something more than just like,
But the idea is that the fact is that to generate the kind of brainwaves he's looking for, and whether he's really seeing brainwaves, it's not quite clear. It takes more and more energy to get to move the stylus on the wall chart,
the EEG to record,
right?
Yeah.
The stylus, so that's for the recording. And it said, why do you have to keep jolting? Why do you have to keep taking dead bodies and putting more people? It's almost as if the thing does have a life, that he's feeding something. And it's never,
but it's not what he thinks it is. Yeah,
it's not quite clear. And this harkens back to the initial thing. You have to be careful what you're opening because of this veil that you're trying to pull back, because you don't know what are the elements supporting the opening and what's lurking behind that in addition to what you're trying to achieve. And I like the film because it's like you just said, as far as we know, he's just nuts. He just thinks he heard this. He thought he saw this. Certainly the vortex could have been some kind of energy field that was generated by all the power he's throwing into it. You could do that. You could put energy through a fog cloud within the chamber and develop a tornado. So I mean, I understand what's going on here in the magnetic, but there's all kinds of quirky things like the magnetic pull of the body that you have to harness yourself in. So, and I like it. I like the fact that you're really not quite sure.
Right, and that's the main thing, I think, is that the direction of the film, despite the fact that I think Dimitrik is a very competent director, and the film is definitely beautiful to look at, it's nice to see, finally, an exterior shot in this movie that is actually a miniature, and a very good miniature. Mm-hmm. The site of the house on Barsham Harbor is actually much more atmospheric and effective, or maybe it's just because we're finally getting a change of scenery rather than being in some nondescript American city. We don't know where it is. Now we're being told, all right, we're in New England. We have this setting. We have this very clear sort of, change.
It's not as good as Orson Welles coming in through the ceiling window, looking down at his wife,
right?
Gradually pulling in, but it's like that. Like you see the gridiron.
Well, I didn't mention in the synopsis that another interesting choice they make in the movie is to have Anne, his daughter, narrate the movie, despite the fact that she's not in any of the essential scenes of the movie.
Yeah, right.
So she's never commenting directly on what happens in the film. It's only alluded to that she basically has bits and pieces of what the story is. But you're right, and there's this, it's weird because like Amanda Duff's narration for the movie, it's almost reminiscent again of later noir films and the sort of way that they would play with sort of subjectivity and atmosphere through narration. I'm thinking particularly of number one, the next film that the next significant film Edward Dimitrik does, which is Murder, My Sweet, a very important film in the development of the film noir. But also I'm thinking of movies like Rebecca, which has a very similar opening thing where the narrator is like, this is the house, this is the place, and it's drawing you in this very atmospheric way. And it sort of relates back to that, again, the sort of parallel development in and evolution of the noir and the horror movie, which is the extent to which that noir films are really just crime and mystery movies, but that are shot like horror movies.
Yes, right. Or gothic. I almost have a gothic feel, but not really a gothic feel.
Yeah, they're expressionistic without being too over the top or avant-garde about it. But I think that is the thing, is that, like, despite Dimitrich's very good direction of the movie, I think it's compromised by the structuring of the story and by the limitations of what Columbia was willing to give them to make it. It's compromised to being a little too pedestrian and literal, so that the ambiguity, you really need to kind of squint for the ambiguity. But you're right, there is like this feeling that this very, and maybe it is just like, I mean, part of it is just the brilliance of that laboratory set piece.
As we as nuts as he is.
Exactly.
Watching it.
Yeah. Like,
you know, did he hear a voice? Do we just hear a voice? Because it's very subliminal, her voice, that he hears. And you wonder, too, you get close and you say, wait, is there a voice actually that he hears? And and you have to also remember the time constraints for the film. Right?
Yeah. I mean, this wouldn't have been shot more than 2 weeks. They would have had like 4 weeks to write the screenplay.
And the actual length of the film, what's the runtime?
It's literally like 65 minutes.
I mean, it's ridiculous. All this packed in,
adapted from a 225-page book.
I mean, it's really amazing. And like you said, the supporting cast is excellent, I think, in helping
out. With
the
exception of Richard Fisk, who unfortunately is another one of these kind of blank slate. Luckily, he's really not in the film very long. Right. They seem to have... he's in it slightly more than the previous guy in Before I Hang, who was apparently so unengaging that they couldn't even bother to figure out why he's in the film at all. But Amanda Duff is quite good in the movie. I think Anne Revere plays such a sinister character, and she's able to tell so much. It's a great dichotomy between her and Boris Karloff, because whereas Karloff, at least at the moment in which they meet, Karloff is a very animated and expository actor. I mean, Boris Karloff has such a distinct voice. He's the guy you put in the movie to read highly animated, important sounding lines. Whereas Anne Revere, while she's talking to him, she's able to express so much with just her gaze and just the subtle ways in which her eyes move. And you see a complete transformation in her character. And it's so... She might be one of the most disturbing things about the movie, because she's so straightforwardly a complete psychopath. And like he's very invested in telling her all these things about how, like, you're this really remarkable person and you could be the secret to helping me contact my wife. But she starts out just looking at him like with absolutely no affect, but like with a weird kind of repulsion to him, like no sympathy or empathy whatsoever. But then we just see the subtle change in the gears turning in her mind and through her eyes, turning from this guy is completely insane to I am going to control this guy and milk him for everything he's worth. Right. I mean, absolutely. She is really an interesting character in the whole film. I like to know where her husband is. It's Mrs. Blanche Walters. And he's singing with Paul Revere and the Raiders.
At least everybody else had a husband, right? So Mrs. Marcy had Seth Marcy, and I just could. Well, wait a minute. Obviously the husband must.
Yeah, you're right. What did happen to Mr. Walters?
I mean, exactly. But the idea is probably that's why she needs the money. She says that in the seance, I'm not a woman of means and I need the money. She doesn't say it like so much like that. Right. She's not deferential. Right, she's like, like once she's caught and she's proved to be a liar, she doesn't give a shit. She's like, yeah, that's what I do. Right. What are you going to do about it? Right. I think Kenneth MacDonald, he's a pretty big Western character actor. He does a really good job as the sheriff in this movie in the short time he's on screen.
I think one of the best character moments in the movie is that transition from the period where, once the transition between Julian deciding that he's going to go off with Mrs. Walters to this house in Barsham Harbor to the 2 years later. I think one of the best character scenes in the movie really is where we suddenly reorient our character perspective to being that of Sheriff Ed Willis, who really is just a minor character. This is a nice little flourish of the writing of the movie to see this from his perspective. And then the first person he meets is Dorothy Adams as the maid, Mrs. Marcy, and she also gives an excellent performance. And there's this.
Yeah, she's very good. Yeah, she's very good. Overall, she's very good. Yes.
Yeah, and for the brief time that she's on screen, because she's going to get murdered in the, the second to next scene. But there's just a wonderful, it's like it's one of those things where it's like that scene and the performances between them alone. I mean, it almost puts the rest of the main cast to shame. I mean, like they're getting so much more out of these small roles. They're investing them with so much more like life and a sense. I think what the supporting cast of the movie does is that they're giving the film a qualitative sense of naturalism that was lacking from the previous Mad Doctor movies. Right. There's no balance.
Yeah. This is. Yeah, and it's almost like there's a triangle of power here where you have Karloff, who Anne Revere's character thinks she's able to control him, really finds out she can't control him.
Well, she can control him until the moment that he needs her to be in the chair, and then eventually, that's the thing. I think I inaccurately wrote that she passes out. I think the point is supposed to be that he does finally kill her.
Oh, he kills her. Yeah.
So it's like, she gets her comeuppance in that form. But there's this. There's this.
Well, she didn't really kill anybody. She just sort of
covers up.
She said, and of course, all that's self-serving, right, for herself. And you're right. I think that it's important to have those elements in it, and I think it works really well, which means very, very tight script. Yeah. When you think about and you have to say the right lines to convey that kind of atmosphere and those components for the film in those particular times, and they do a really good job in doing that. I think I agree with you 100% about the voiceover and the narration that is probably added after a lot of stuff you told me afterwards that seems a little bit out of place to possibly, you could add more to that than I can.
Well, I mean, I mean, the fact of the matter is that I and this isn't my original idea. I was, as usual, I was listening to the audio commentary by Kim Newman and Steve Jones for the film. They're British film historians, and they commented on this that there's this sense that the narration of the film might have been something that was added in post-production. The thing is that Kim Newman and Stephen Jones don't provide a reason why the narration was added. They just sort of comment on the fact that, Anne isn't really in most of the scenes that she's narrating over. She's not the perspective of the movie. It's clearly supposed to be Karloff's perspective for the first half of the movie, and then the second half of the movie takes a more objective point of view. But I think what the key to understanding why that might have been added in later is that, again, because of the tightness with which this film was written. And I think part of it might have been because they were trying something new. They were doing a little more in the writing. They were saying, all right, let's find a good, and not leaning on a classic work of 18th century scientific romance or whatever, but actually looking for a contemporary work of fiction to draw upon as the inspiration for the movie, and really challenging themselves to try to make this a different kind of Mad Doctor movie. I think what the sort of tightness and the compromises that they had to make because of the very economical production that they were forced to make, there's a lot of geographic confusion to the film if you take out the narration. Like, so the movie starts with a slow zoom in on this miniature of the Barsham Harbor House, which, again, I'm also not sure that that wasn't added in post-production. I'm not sure that that was originally intended, because if without the narration, you zoom in on this house and then you cross-dissolve to an exterior on a very rainy night, and you would assume that that's supposed to be the exterior of the Barsham house, but in fact, we are now flashing backwards in time, and this is the exterior
of the science hall.
Of the university science hall. But here's the thing, because we then also don't have an establishing shot of the exterior of Julian's city home or his apartment flat, there's also this sort of there's this disjuncture between, wait, you would be forgiven for thinking the laboratory is supposed to be at his house rather than it being at the university, and the place where Anne is a separate location. And so there is that element to it where it seems like they added certain things in editing at the last minute because they realized that a lot of the spatial continuity of the film is borderline incomprehensible because they were so economic about establishing where anybody is supposed to be. I think you're right about that.
In fact, I was faked out. I made a mistake myself, right? We were talking about, we saw the house, right? It was the one with the pillars. I said, wait, oh no, that was the science hall.
Right.
So I was already confused.
Right. The narration doesn't really facilitate us understanding what's going on much better.
Where we are. And it's maybe a lot of it's the fact that I can't follow a movie. But you're right. I mean, it's just it's
not that you can't follow a movie. It's that, like, this is basic this is basic, like, montage theory.
Right.
If you show an exterior like of the Barsham house on this craggy hill in Maine in this very dark and stormy exterior, and then you cross-dissolve to another establishing exterior on a rainy night, you're going to assume that that's the same exterior.
Yeah.
This is basic montage theory.
Yeah.
And they, but that's the thing, is that, like, so they add the narration of Anne in possibly to clarify certain things that aren't obvious. It doesn't really work, but it is this sort of happy serendipity, because the thing is that Anne's narration is still, like, successfully ominous and sort of weirdly at odds with what we're seeing. And again, it informs again upon the weird sort of contradiction between the very straightforward and economical way in which the story is told and our sense of ambiguity and a sense of, like, whether we can really trust what we're observing.
Right.
Because why are we hearing this woman's voice? She's not in the scene. The movie's not about her.
Well,
How did she know any of this happened,
Well, obviously put it together. She was there at the house at the final scene, so she's seen where he's been moved. Oh, and he's sent away, right? She's sent away to go out. She's sent away from home, right? So we know she's pushed out while he sells the house and goes to this place.
Right.
So she probably had, and there's also a couple of, why haven't you answered any of my letters? I didn't get any of your letters. And it turns out that Anne Revere's character
Mrs. Walters
has been stealing the mail.
Yeah.
So, I mean, so there's enough in it, but you gotta think what's going on. You can't just sort of like sit back with a popcorn and look at this movie and hope that you could put everything together, because then you're left with the morass of the vortex and the things that are going on in the laboratory, and you're missing all the human elements that are involved here. Like you say, the Kenneth MacDonald sheriff, all these people that fill in, and Dorothy Adams filling in as the housemaid. All these elements that are so crucial to giving life to the film.
Right.
Given and it works really well. It does well. It does well, I think, like you said, in a short movie.
Yeah, and it sort of does in a sort of economical way, it does a good job of unmooring us from a comfortable perspective.
Right.
Because by the time after Kenneth MacDonald and Dorothy Adams have their very great capsule scene from their perspective, we're then reintroduced to Boris Karloff's character, and he might as well be a completely different character. Like, he's almost like zombified to a certain extent.
Well, he looks tired.
Yeah, well, he's certainly aged more. They're
He looks
certainly
exhausted.
adding on
He looks
the old
exhausted.
age
He looks
makeup.
exhausted.
It doesn't look like it's only been
Yeah.
2 years. And
Yeah.
this is also very consistent with the novel.
Right.
I think
It's very interesting. Yeah, very interesting, and like I said, it does. It fits together very well. I mean, there's no doubt about it. And all these movies are somewhat different. I mean, this one's clearly much different.
the most radically different, I would say.
I would say, yeah, I agree. And maybe it's because based upon a novel that they tried to glean so well and try to get so much out of it.
Yeah, and like I said, it's for the changes that they made. It's remarkably faithful to the novel. I mean, the main thing to say is that the first half hour. So just to give an impression of structurally what is so radically different about the movie versus the novel, rather than the movie just being an abbreviated version of the novel. And it relates back to something that I had alluded to back on the episode Before I Hang, but didn't really explain, which is the idea that this is sort of the house style of Columbia's B-movie programmers, which is that they're not 3-act stories, they're 2-act stories. That you have the first act, which is the entire prologue, that's your first act. And the second act is just a long climax. And so there's no middle point where you chart a sort of rising action,
right,
and then a descending act, and
a
denouement.
Right.
It's very forceful and abrupt, and it's obviously, very cheap and economical. So what's very interesting is that, so The Edge of Running Water, the most important things to note, just in terms of how that story is told, it is not from Julian's perspective, it's not from Anne's perspective, it's from Richard Sayles' perspective. We're introduced to the story with Richard Sayles arriving in Barsham Harbor in response to a letter from Julian Blair. And so the book is the book has a far more of an emphasis on learning from Sayles' perspective, slowly and gradually pulling back the curtain over what has been happening on Barsham Harbor, what are the reasons it's been happening. It's just as much a mystery story as it is a science fiction tale, and that's even the reason for the title The Edge of Running Water. The Edge of Running Water is an allusion to the place where Mrs. Walters drops Mrs. Marcy's body after the night that she's killed. And so there's this emphasis much more on mystery and the subjectivity of the narrator versus the film version where, so just to give an idea, the first half hour of the film, the entire first act, the entire prologue takes up one chapter in The Edge of Running Water. And so that means you have one chapter in The Edge of Running Water, which is a flashback chapter. Again, it's entirely from Richard Sayles' perspective. That is then expanded and embellished upon into the first act of the film. And then, so subsequently, the entire rest of the book needs to be condensed into a half hour, into the final climax. Of course, they change the perspective of the story. They make it fundamentally following Julian Blair, which means that they eliminate a lot of the mystery of the story. They take away the part where you as a spectator are gradually learning through Sayles the horrific and really repulsive things that we're about to discover. But other than that, it's still remarkably faithful to the novel. It's still, and I think still fundamentally it gets back to that thing we were talking about the very sinister underpinning of the story, which nobody except for one of Julian's colleagues, when he's like saying, all right, I think I found a means of contacting the dead, and the colleague is like, you shouldn't open a doorway. You have no idea what's on the other side. You have no idea what you're inviting in. Besides that, no one really explicitly comments upon the sinister underpinning of the story, which is that we really don't know what Julian is doing. Julian has a very firm conviction that what he's doing is opening a portal to the land of the dead, that he's receiving communications from his wife. But we have no idea if this is just confirmation bias because he's so traumatized and he's manically determined. The book is really important in sort of informing upon what's getting lost in translation, because so with Richard Sayle's perspective in the book, the thing that, because it's from Sayle's perspective, we don't see Mrs. Marcy getting killed when the machine is turned on. What we do see is Richard Sayles and Anne walking up from the river to the Barsham house at night, and then they hear this building sound from inside the building. They see a light in the window, and so much of the story is about this sound that the machine generates before we see what the machine is generating. And so much of it is because Sayles eventually figures out that Julian is trying to contact the dead. There's this element of the story in which he's questioning whether or not he really hears voices in the sound, but then he himself denies it because he's so micro-focused on the idea that I cannot allow it to be true that what Julian has done has actually been successful at what he claims it to do, because number one, it's impossible. I reject it objectively as a rational scientist. And number two, I can't allow myself to believe it because I can't give in to Julian's madness. And so there's this element of the story in which it's much more ambiguous, but because of its ambiguity, I guess the better way to say it is that...
Well, if your narrator doesn't believe stuff or can't let himself be vulnerable to what's going on, you're not going to know either.
Right, exactly. Yeah. I guess the proper way to put it is that in the book, the ambiguity itself is much more explicit. Are there voices in the noise that this vortex or this hole in the universe is generating? Or is it just noise? Is it just loud white noise and static?
Right,
and you hear whatever you want to hear in it, which of course relates to the theme of Mrs. Walters being a medium and this sort of, poetic irony of a scientist basically recreating a medium's hokery, but with science itself as the sort of patina of authenticity that you can put trust in. And, I think what it gets down to is that the movie itself, and Newman and Jones comment upon this in the commentary, is that these guys are both very well-read and very well-researched historians of horror and science fiction. And to their knowledge, The Devil Commands might be the first film to depict the concept of a interdimensional vortex or gateway to another realm. This might be the first one. And so it really is kind of interesting that, it's, the way it's depicted in the film is much different than it is in the book. And actually, one sec, I'm going to get the book and I'm going to read what it says about the, in the film, the vortex itself, like you're saying, it's depicted as a sort of a cyclone. It's this whirling thing at the center of this seance table. Another thing that's different about the book and the movie is that, and this is something that the movie does, which again, this is part of the limiting factors of the generic conventions of the movies versus literature. In the movie, they sort of put more vacuum tubes into this radio receiver by stealing corpses from the graveyard. That's not in the book, and there doesn't seem to actually be a justification for it in the movie because it's never explained why a corpse would be conductive of electricity. Like, if it's embalmed and prepared for death, would it be better at conducting electricity or worse? It doesn't make any sense.
It doesn't make any sense.
It's clear that it needs to be like a human body. And in the book, this seance table does not have living corpses, but has these almost like these armatures made to look like human beings that are constructed out of wires and cables and are all connected to each other, which I think does a much better job of impressing Julian's madness that he couldn't just again, he
Why
couldn't-
just take a spool of it and
Right.
not,
It's
why
like,
fashion
why not just a giant vacuum tube? Why did you have to make people? So it shows like the descent of his thinking. And of course, it's like, to me, when I imagine it, and in the
That's
movie,
really beautiful because it does recapitulate like a seance table, right?
right, exactly. Well, that's the
We
entire
have
point.
animatronics all around, right? That
Yeah,
are,
and I mean, and the movie actually does a fairly good job of realizing it, especially when Mrs. Marcy first discovers it. It's a very disturbing
is.
shot, and it's
Yep.
it's almost like predicting of like H.R. Giger's artwork, this sort of fusion of organic and biomechanical elements, this fusion of science fiction and occult imagery. But then as far as what the machine produces, in the movie, it's sort of realized as like a cyclone. It looks like it was literally like a water tank cyclone that was just photographed specially and then duplicated on film. This is how this thing is described in the book. So yeah, it's again, it's also all the way at the it's very much at the end of the book. It's literally near the climax. This is the first time we actually see what the film produces. And so he describes it. This is Sayles narrating. To this day, I cannot be sure what the thing was that I saw happen there. It began as a point of blackness which I could not see with great distinctness because it was between me and the far wall. Point of blackness is not a good description, and yet I hardly know what else to call it. There against the grayish yellow of the room's faded wallpaper was a thing suspended in the air as it seemed to me at first. It was in no way human. It hung there, pulsing faintly and unevenly, but always growing with each expansion slightly more than it shrank with its contractions. When I first noticed it, the thing was the size of a large pea. I have called it black, and yet it was actually a colorlessness so intense, parenthetically, to define the thing in terms of its opposite, that it seemed to absorb the very glance with which I looked at it. I can remember nothing further of the way that thing appeared to me or of the emotions I experienced watching it. My memory presents every detail of what followed, but not as part of my own experience. As I stood there, my eyes fixed on that black focal point, I lost awareness of myself in an emotion of so appalling and overwhelming that there is no accurate term for it. Fear it was not, for I was past the point of being afraid. I think perhaps the word awe comes closer to it than anything else. The blackness over the center of the black table grew. It expanded in the air with steadily increasing speed. The 7 figures never moved, never looked at it, were deaf to the sound that filled my ears and hammered at the walls of the room till it was wonderful that they did not shatter. As the thing grew, it became more clearly three-dimensional, although that description is in itself meaningless. We know in actual experience nothing which is not three-dimensional. Dimension is, in fact, with 3 attributes, length, breadth, and thickness, but they are triune and inseparable aspects of material existence. Not so this heart of darkness that beat in and out, to and fro, larger and smaller, over the center of the table. It had no dimension at all. It consumed dimension, negated it, developed like a parasite on the shape and frame of the familiar world. Additionally, when he's later remembering it, he describes it like, the evidence for my conclusion was purely circumstantial, but that was plenty. The rush of air into the center of the thing, as if it were being drawn into a complete vacuum. The fact that neither the air nor the things it had carried with it returned. The very appearance of the blackness, like an extra-dimensional whirlpool. And above everything else, the cold conviction that the thing which Julian Blair's potential created was beyond all the bounds of our universe. It seemed to me that something in my mind recognized it. That was absurd, of course, and yet how had Julian created this thing? By magnifying the radiations, the waves given off by the human brain and nervous system, something like that, according to his account. I snatched my thoughts back from the gulf toward which they were headed. If man were not altogether a physical being, if he possessed in himself a contact with an existence neither spatial nor of time, and if that contact were to be artificially produced, even by sheer imitation of the sort of which Julian had openly confessed, then what would be created would be no bridge, but a mechanical arbitrary rent in the warp and woof of the fabric of the physical universe. A lesion, indeed, through which everything known streamed into the unknown. A hole in the dike. No, that wasn't quite accurate. A leak in the helmet of the diver would be closer. it's very fascinating because what Sloane is very much describing in that connection, what does that sound like to you is growing in the middle of this laboratory? Because it does not sound like a cyclone.
Right. It does not. Although he says it pulsates and things are drawn into it and then disappear, or or its dimensions take on the attributes of the room, and then it increases in size like that.
It also doesn't have color. In fact, color seems to disappear into it.
Right.
So it's black,
Sucking
but
light
it's
in,
not
too.
black.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So what does it sound like to you?
Black hole.
Yeah, that sounds like a black hole to me. And we're once again returning to the amazing prescience of these dumb B movies, because look, black holes, although
Einstein proposed them already, though.
Well,
right?
actually, it was all the way back in the 18th century, there were mathematicians and physicists who would propose the idea of there being stars that reach such a point of mass that they start contracting in on themselves and start absorbing everything, including light itself. They were referred to as dark stars. It was because of Einstein's theory of relativity that mathematicians and physicists in the 50s and the 60s could finally start to really formulate a theory of how these sort of event horizons in the universe could exist, where everything, including light, is pulled into its center mass.
Mm-hmm.
But it was not until 1971 that anybody had actually found a black hole and thus proved that they exist.
Right.
But we're not even talking about like published 1958 and 60s articles. This is a science fiction writer basically coming up with the idea of the black hole, and not just a black hole, but even more proactively, the idea of the black hole as a bridge in time and space, as a bridge between dimensions and realms of reality, which is the sort of thing that's lacking from the movie in any sort of, because the movie doesn't have the ability to expound upon the reaction of a narrator and the specific internal dialogue of one person's mind, particularly a person who's actually informed about what he's looking at is. So you have this problem where the movie starts to lose the really sinister underpinning of Sloane's book, which is whether or not the pursuit that Julian has made to try to bridge the world between the land of the living and the land of the dead has actually basically just ripped open a hole in the center of the universe that's going to either A, consume everything, or what is on the other side
that's going to come through.
Is something that is too horrific for human minds to even contemplate.
Right.
And so what we come to is this idea that, William Sloane was also a publisher in addition to being an author. And he would have been familiar, I'm confident, with the works of H.P. Lovecraft. And H.P. Lovecraft, despite the fact that he himself was influenced by writers like Ambrose Bierce and Algernon Blackwood, authors who were very good at dealing with the horror of the unknown and the idea that the reader is often better at creating horror in their own minds with scant traces of detail than you are by explaining things to them. H.P. Lovecraft was very important because his personal theory as a writer was that, which was born out of his understanding of contemporary science, that H.P. Lovecraft had this sort of epiphany that the sheer vastness of the universe as we understood it, complemented by the knowledge of Darwinian evolution, that human beings themselves are just the descendants of the smallest microscopic slime, contributed to his understanding that the world is not anthropocentric. Human beings are not the center of the universe. We tell ourselves this, but really in the grand scheme of things, we're no more than a speck of dust in this cold, uncaring, chaotic void. And anything we can come up with in terms of giving man a kind of meaning or relationship to this void is really just a puny, apes papering over of the horrific reality that in Lovecraft's fiction, so many of his books, just like with what Sloane's character describes in that scene, you notice how very much of Sloane's narration is about the character attempting to describe the thing that he's seeing, but ultimately telling his reader, I can't describe it to you because I literally don't have the words. There's no conceptual framework for telling you. I can't wrap my mind around this thing. That's pure Lovecraft. Lovecraft would do that all the time, where at the climactic moment where a character is confronted with this force or being from the beyond, this thing that is beyond human comprehension, he would have the character describe it, but then recline back and say, I can't possibly convey it to you. I can't wrap my head around what I was looking at. And then, of course, like a lot of his stories, the people who witness these events end up in an insane asylum because literally their minds are like broken by this confrontation with like the unknown. So the type of horror that H.P. Lovecraft was developing in the 20s and that William Sloane seems to be carrying on with his book is what's known as cosmic horror. This is not a horror that is anthropocentric. This is not a horror that is about the opposition between good and evil. This is a horror about the idea of confronting the human reader with the idea that there are certain aspects of the world in which we live in that are so vast that it puts into perspective that good and evil, God and the devil, the living and the dead, really these things are meaningless in the vastness of time and of space. And so what I think the movie doesn't really capture is the idea, and especially because it's given the title, like, The Devil Commands. It's like, you know, you even alluded to this before, is that, like, this isn't really about the devil commanding. This is about the idea that Julian has created this doorway, but he himself is using his own spiritual faith and his spiritual obsession to confirm his bias and explain what he's doing, but in reality, he has no clue what is on the other side. He has no clue what he's dealing with, and and ultimately the conclusion of the story, which is faithful in the movie to the book, is that the only solution is that Julian just disappears into this void. He's literally consumed by this thing. Right. Yeah, so it's fascinating because it leaves open the possibility that not only is The Devil Commands the first work of American popular cinema and perhaps global cinema to feature a interdimensional gateway, it is also perhaps the first American film to be an example of cosmic horror, of a horror which may explain why, despite the fact that it's still so compromised and literal, you still feel that underpinning of the sinister, because it's a movie that, in its constant shifting of perspective and its sort of confusing geographical and spatial continuity, sort of gives the impression that it's a movie where human beings aren't at the center of it, that the perspective that we have, it's even beyond good and evil. It's like this movie is something that we're watching from a perspective where everyone is just puny and nobody really has any understanding or relationship to what's going on. And I think that's it makes it much more fascinating, I think, than, even if it's not technically as good as maybe, you know, it's weird. I still think The Man with Nine Lives might be the best one, despite the fact that it's also the most fascist. But The Devil Commands is nonetheless the most interesting. It's and in terms of like the prescience of it, it's the most prescient. This is the most forward thinking that these horror movies have been, and it's the closest. And again, we're ebbing closer and closer and closer to films that aren't even horror. This is like hard science fiction that we're dealing with.
Right.
Yeah.
Agreed. Right. Yeah.
I think that's a good place to leave it, honestly. But so obviously, you know, at this point, you know, like I said in the episode, you know, Boris Karloff, as soon as he's finished filming The Devil Commands, he's going to be jumping on a plane and he's going to be going all the way to New York City, where he's going to do rehearsals for Arsenic and Old Lace, which is going to premiere in January of 1941 and is going to be a huge January 1942, sorry, and is going to be a huge, massive critical and financial hit. When he comes back to Columbia, he's going to find something very interesting. And it's that in order that the script that they finally give him, which is going to be his final film with the company to fulfill his contract, the script that they're going to be giving him is clearly one that is going to be capitalizing, let's say, on his success with Arsenic and Old Lace. So when we come back, we'll be doing a movie that's actually, sometimes it's not even considered part of the Mad Doctor cycle because it's actually a horror comedy. So when we come back with our next episode, which will be a bonus for patrons, you will be listening to us talk about The Boogeyman Will Get You. So stay tuned and join us next time on Monster Craze Memoirs.